So everyone, welcome back to Orthodoxy 201. We are now in our fourth session, and we are looking at philosophy. We already started this segment last time. As a quick review, we looked at the question, what does Athens have to do with Jerusalem? We talked a little bit about that quote from Tertullian. We also then looked at some scriptural passages and some commentary from the fathers. We looked at early Christian philosophers. We talked about the proper usage of philosophy, and we referenced this quote from St. Gregory the Theologian. We looked at the concept of Egyptian gold. We also spoke about St. Alexander of Comana, the charcoal burner. And then we started to look at philosophy before Christ, introducing Socrates. We spoke a little bit about Plato, and that's where we kind of left off. We have still Aristotle to look at, the Stoics, and Philo of Alexandria. So again, first Socrates, who's considered the father of philosophy. His dates are there, so he was 5th and 4th century before Christ. We spoke briefly about the Milian dialogue and the relationship between philosophy and that which is politically expedient. Talked about the concept of might being right. We looked at realpolitik, the way that that principle finds its application in the ancient world and also in the modern world. Introduced Plato, who was a student of Socrates and also the teacher of Aristotle. He's kind of the link between those two. And then went into the concept of the good, which was preparatory to the understanding of God. All the while, we've been building a case that philosophy was given by God himself to the Greeks and to other peoples of the ancient world to prepare them for the coming of Christ, who is the principle, the reason, the order behind all of creation. He ultimately is the good, the beautiful, that which is true, and that which the philosophers sought. They weren't able to fully see Christ, but they could anticipate him. Just like the prophets, the Jewish prophets in the Old Testament had an understanding of who Christ would be, but didn't fully have that revelation yet. And we left off here at Plato's cave. This symbol, this allegory from this parable from his great work, The Republic. So can I ask, Georgianne, can you lead us off by taking this slide, please?
Yeah, sure. No, you can hear me, right?
Yes.
Plato's cave is an allegory illustrating his philosophy on knowledge and reality. It depicts prisoners chained in a cave, facing a wall where shadows of objects are projected. They perceive these shadows as reality. However, if one prisoner escapes and sees the outside world, they realize the shadows were mere illusions. This symbolizes the journey from ignorance to enlightenment, where knowledge reveals true reality. The cave represents the material world. Shadows are sensory perceptions, and sunlight symbolizes the forms or ultimate truths. Plato suggests philosophical education leads to understanding the forms, liberating individuals from the illusions of the cave.
Thank you, Georgianne. Can you take this other slide as well, please?
Sure. The allegory contains a number of movements: the enchainment to the shadows, the releasement from the chains, the passage out of the cave and into the light of the sun, and the return back from the light of the sun into the cave.
Thank you. Okay, so this illustration, I think, is a little bit more helpful than the previous. It kind of shows the cave, and you can see the men who they're on the left in those chains. In the allegory, the men are chained by their feet and by their necks. Their hands are free. And that's an important part of the illustration. And we'll come back to that in a moment. Behind them in the cave are the people who are putting on kind of like a puppet show. They're creating before them in the venue or in the mode of shadows images, and they're images from the quote unquote real world. So men, animals, they put on this kind of pageant, this performance, and the men who are looking at the shadows on the wall, having been in that state for so long, having forgotten the real world, are enchanted by these shadows, and they believe what they see to be the summation of all reality. They believe these shadows to be real. One level removed, we see again that there are people who are putting on kind of a performance. But if you were to go beyond that, another level out of the cave, where you can see the man who is escaping, entering into the light, he enters into the real world, and there he could come across actual real men, actual real animals, the movements of the world, with regard to nature, with regard to men, that there's actual reality beyond that which is just simply an illusion in the cave. Okay, so everybody understand kind of the setup here, what Plato is laying out for us. If we look at the teaching of the cave and what it means for us, we see Plato making a case for philosophy, for a higher understanding of reality, to moving beyond things which are simply illusion to that which is concrete in the sense of not just, let's say, things that we see and perceive with the senses, but things that are more concrete with a higher realm, the realm of the mind, the realm of forms and ideas and concepts, and above and beyond that, even an allusion to the highest realm, the highest form, and that which is, the giver of forms, that which is behind forms, that would be that which is true, that which is beautiful, that which is good. So there's a movement from that which is illusory to that which is real, that which is maybe, let's say, imminent to us, to that which is transcendent, and that which enslaves us to that which frees us. And in the allegory, this man who was formerly chained is freed, and he is led out of the cave. So he sees these people putting on this performance, this pageantry, and as he comes out of the cave and he enters into the light, it's difficult for him to see because his eyes are so accustomed to the darkness of the cave. And when he enters into the light, it's a painful process that he kind of recoils from. He has to shield his eyes. It's too bright. But he finally then adjusts to the light, and he's able to see things as they truly are. And having seen the world as it truly is, having come to this enlightenment, he feels an inner compulsion, a responsibility to go back to the cave, to his fellow prisoners, and to tell them that, listen, it's all an illusion, that there's a real world out there, and you can come and you can escape and you can enter into that world. So in the Republic, the man goes back into the cave and he tries to tell the prisoners about what he's seen. Now, as he enters into the cave, he's going from light back into darkness, and his eyes have to readjust again. In fact, when he enters into the cave, he kind of loses his sight. He's not able to see. So he comes to these prisoners who think that they're entirely free and they're enjoying everything that life has to offer them in watching this pageantry unfold in the shadows. He comes to them as a man who is, in their eyes, now blind. He can't even see the shadows anymore. And he's talking about a world that, to their understanding, doesn't exist. And they don't believe him. They don't believe that there, it is kind of this intermediate level of people putting on a show, nor do they believe that beyond that there's an actual another world. And they rebuff him so much so, they reject him so much so that they say, you better stop talking about this, because if you continue, we may put you to death. And this is very prophetic, if you will, this kind of idea of putting the man who's offering enlightenment to death, right? Who's offering knowledge of things as they truly are, putting him to death because they prefer where they're currently at. They prefer the status quo. They prefer living in darkness and in delusion, right? Now we can see very clear parallels to the Christian story, right? Where Christ is the great enlightener, and he's the one that is offering us to come out of darkness into the light, to become children of the light, right? And yet, the light came to those in darkness, and they rejected that light because their deeds were evil, right? They loved the darkness rather than the light. We hear in the Gospel of St. John. And they even tried to put the light to death, right? The enlightener, the illuminer, to death. Of course, the light could not be conquered, right? It could not be overcome. It could not be destroyed. That the light was victorious, but we still see the kind of fallen human response to the light being at first one of rejection, one of preferring the status quo. Now, when this allegory is given in the Republic, Plato is talking about his teacher. And who's Plato's teacher again? Socrates, yeah. And what was the deal with Socrates? He was talking to the great leaders, the great men of his day, about philosophy and morals, and trying to do that which is ethical and that which is right, rather than what they thought was expedient, what they thought would accomplish their worldly agenda and goals. And he was educating the youth about this. He was telling the youth, about philosophy and a higher way to think about life, and that there are things that are more important than the pageantry of life as it is known. And Socrates was put to death, right? And he was put to death because he was convicting the rulers of his age. He was speaking truth to power, and they couldn't tolerate, they couldn't take it. They preferred to, have the dominion over the people, to keep them, if you will, in chains. But the people themselves also, preferred to remain in their chains. And that's why in Plato's allegory here, he makes it very clear that the people's hands are not tied. People's hands are freed, right? The prisoners, if they wanted to, they could get out of their chains. First thing you do if you're going to put somebody in chains is you lock up their hands, right? That's the first thing you do. And yet, here in this symbolic imagery, in this parable, their hands are free because they are willingly remaining in darkness. All right, so that's the parable of the cave in Plato. Now, there are modern day parallels to this too, right? He wasn't just speaking about a snapshot of time in the ancient world with his teacher Socrates, but the truths that we see in the cave are universal and timeless. So the image on the left here is very often shown when we talk about media propaganda, right? The rulers and leaders of this age are very much those who are involved in keeping and sharing and disseminating information. And, knowledge is power. And they use that information, they use that knowledge in a way sometimes that's not ethical, that doesn't correspond to truth, but which is advantageous to whatever their agenda might be. So you can see the framing of the shot on the left, right? The one man is being chased by the guy with the knife, and yet the camera frames in such that it looks like the exact opposite is happening, right? And how many times does that happen? I would submit to you that happens every single day with media coverage. And it has to be happening too, because in modern day America, you can just flip from one channel to the next and you get the exact opposite commentary on seemingly the same facts, right? Exact opposite. And that's again what's being portrayed here. On the right-hand side, we have this comic of how, people line up for lies which are comforting and avoid the unpleasant truths, right? It's easier to stay in the place of shadows and enjoy the entertainment and the pageantry than to face, the light and go through that transition and come to, some kind of real knowledge of situations and have to deal with reality as it truly is. Okay, so when we were dealing with perception, I made a reference to The Matrix. Some of you are familiar with that movie. And, there are other movies that we see in modern times that deal with the same concept of, is perception reality? And do we, have kind of an understanding that is accurate and correspondent to, the real world? This kind of these themes that are presented in the cave by Plato some 2,000 plus years ago are still being presented to us today. It's still a matter of discussion. It's still a matter of interest. So some modern movies explore themes reminiscent of Plato's allegory of the cave, which examines the concept of perception, reality, and enlightenment. Here are a few examples. So you have The Matrix, 1999, Dark City, 1998, Inception, 2010, The Truman Show. Have people seen The Truman Show? Yeah, very, very powerful movie. Makes you think. The 13th Floor and Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. So I haven't seen a few of those, but I have seen some. And it goes to this kind of this question of reality and perception. And it's very much something that is prevalent, this question, in today's modern age as we deal with advances in technology. So Elon Musk, he believes that we're in a simulation, right? That we are in a matrix of sorts. And he says basically, there's this quote here, there's 1 billion to 1 chance we're living in base reality. So he's saying we're not actually living in reality. We are living in a simulation. And he lays it out. That image on the left is a picture of Pong. So that was one of like the first video games where you have these 2 paddles that move back and forth on the screen, and there's a ball that bounces back and forth. And it's very basic, very simple. That's video games 40 years ago, 50 years ago, something like that. The first Atari or whatever, ColecoVision, those ancient video game systems. But if you were to look at modern video games today, or look at augmented or virtual reality, we're light years ahead. And he says, if in 50 years we've made so much progress, what would it be like in another 50 years, in 100 years, 200 years? Would we be able to distinguish what we call reality from virtual reality? the resolution of the imagery would be so advanced. We would have, input and output in all of the senses. The AI would be extremely advanced, right? We wouldn't know if we're talking to someone who's a real person or somebody who's simply just a computer, right? And think about also, beyond that, think about how much we are addicted to our technological devices, how much we become enslaved to them, like the people in the cave who have their hands free but choose to remain, looking at illusions, shadows. How much time do we spend on social media scrolling, right? Rather than going outside and interacting with people and living in the real world. If, technology gets better and better, how much tighter will those chains be? So just some things to think about. And this is all kind of, unfolding from that imagery of Plato's cave. All right, so let's move on now to another aspect of Plato's cave and his thought in general, and that's this theory of forms. So Plato's theory of forms. And you can see the pyramid structure here, how he moves from those things that are considered to be particulars to lower forms, phenomena, and then higher forms, concepts, and then the highest form, which is the good. All right, so you might go from, let's say, an actual horse, right, to the idea of what a horse might be in its best form, in its truest form. Or you might go from, a beautiful woman to the concept of kind of beauty itself, which ultimately is pointing towards the good. So we move from the physical world to the kind of the world of the mind, or the world of ideas and concepts and forms, right? So can I ask for our next reader, Suzanne, do you mind taking this one?
Sure.
Thank you.
Plato's theory of forms suggests that abstract, perfect concepts exist beyond the physical world. For example, the form of beauty is eternal and perfect, while physical instances of beauty are imperfect reflections. Knowledge of forms attained through philosophical inquiry reveals deeper truths about reality and existence.
Thank you. So are we following this concept of kind of ascent from that which is particular to the general phenomenon, to the concept? There's a movement. So if you think about, like this painting of flowers, there's some beauty there, but you can move from the painting to an actual flower, right? And from that actual flower, you might move to, a flower that's more in bloom, or that has just blossomed, and it becomes, more beautiful. And then we can look at multiple flowers and see the common beauty between them all. And then we have this kind of concept of that which is beautiful. And if we have this concept of that which is beautiful, that which inspired it, that which creates beauty, would be even more beautiful, right? As kind of the source or the fountain of beauty. So this is a movement from that which is, physical and material to that which is immaterial and spiritual. And then, of course, beyond that, that which calls into being both the physical and the material and the spiritual and the immaterial, right? The source or the kind of the cause. Okay, so Andrew, can you take this quote from Plato, please?
Yeah. In the knowledgeable realm, the form of the good is the last thing to be seen, and it is reached only with difficulty. Once one has seen it, however, one must conclude that it is the cause of all that is correct and beautiful in anything, that it produces both light and its source in the visible realm, and that in the intelligible realm it controls and provides truth and understanding, so that anyone who is to act sensibly in private or public must see it.
Thank you, Andrew. So to act sensibly in private or in public, and that's one of Plato's focuses, right? When he writes the Republic, he's talking about kind of a nation or a city-state, a community, a society that is the ideal, right? He's trying to take the good and incarnate it among men, right? And for that to happen, men have to be able to see the good. Men have to be able to progress upward from that which is visible to that which is invisible. Man must be able to move higher and higher and higher. But for that to happen, there's dangers and difficulties, right? As one moves towards the light can also blind. We can prefer the darkness. And when we arrive at enlightenment, whatever degree that is, if we try to bring that enlightenment to those who are still enslaved in darkness, there's, you know, the threat of rejection, or worse, right? So this is a very difficult challenge to pursue the good, but of course it is the highest objective of man. And for man to dwell, as Plato would say, you know, in proper community, he has to have this vision. You absolutely have to. For those who would be leaders, or those who would be rulers or governors of the people, they must become philosophers, he's arguing, he's saying. All right, so let's move from Plato now to his disciple Aristotle. And if we could go back to Georgianne for this reading, please.
Aristotle, 384 to 322 BC, was a student of Plato and later became the teacher of Alexander the Great. Aristotle made significant contributions to many areas of philosophy, including metaphysics, ethics, logic, politics, biology, and aesthetics. In ethics, Aristotle's concept of eudaimonia, or flourishing, emphasized the pursuit of virtue and moral excellence as central to a fulfilling life. His political philosophy in Politics explored the nature of the ideal state, advocating for a balanced government system. His emphasis on empirical observation and logical analysis laid the foundation for scientific inquiry. Aristotle's own scientific work, particularly in biology, included systematic observations and classifications of animals, contributing to the development of the biological sciences. As a teacher, Aristotle founded the Lyceum in Athens, where he conducted research and lectured on diverse subjects. His works, including Nicomachean Ethics and Metaphysics, remain foundational texts in philosophy and science.
Thank you, Georgianne. So Aristotle, he's a big name, right? He accomplished much in the ancient world that became foundational for development of modern sciences and disciplines. Now, Aristotle, again, had as his teacher Plato, who had Socrates as his teacher. And, you know, if you kind of think about the handing down of knowledge from one generation to the next, and you reverse that process, so you're going backwards, at some point, you're going to have to arrive at an originator of kind of truth, right? Or truth itself, that sets in motion, this enlightenment process. You have to arrive at the light, right? In Aristotle, we see this concept of the unmoved mover, right? The kind of the origin, the source, the fountain of everything, everything that is good. So I think Suzanne, are you next? Can you take this one, please?
Yes. The unmoved mover. The concept of the unmoved mover originates from Aristotle's philosophy, particularly in his work Metaphysics and Physics. Aristotle proposed the idea of a prime transcendent cause that initiates motion and change in the universe without being moved or changed itself. The unmoved mover is an eternal, immaterial being that serves as the ultimate cause of all motion and change in the cosmos. It is unmoved because it is not subject to any external forces or influences, and it is the source of the continuous motion and order observed in the world.
Thank you, Suzanne. So this unmoved mover, we're getting very close to the understanding of God, aren't we? And in Plato, it was the good, the transcendent good, right? The good beyond even our concepts, our ideas of the good, right? And in the unmoved mover, the originator, outside time and space, outside those things that are material or even immaterial, right? There's this idea that the unmoved mover is has no cause, but is the cause of all things. Another way to say that would be, the creator of all things, right? The originator of all things. Okay, so that is one contribution of Aristotle that we're going to look at. Another is this concept of virtue as moderation. And this is really important for us to look at when we think about the spiritual life, right? Because in our spiritual life, when we try to keep the commandments of the Lord, we are hopefully moving from vice to virtue, right? Because virtue is participation in the uncreated energies of God. It's participation in the very life of God, that God is virtue itself. And when we move from vice, which is the absence of virtue, and we move towards virtue, we're moving towards God and union with him. And this ultimately is our destiny, to become virtuous people by participation in God's life, to become good as God is good, or even as, or the commandment is to be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect, right? So the movement towards virtue is the movement of the Christian. But it's important to look at this concept of virtue as moderation, so that we understand that virtue is the royal road, the middle path, not erring to the right or erring to the left. When we say moderation, we are not talking about moderation with regard to zeal or with regard to priority. We're not talking about being lukewarm or half-baked or partially in, right? That's not what we're talking about. The Christian is called not to 50%, but to 100%, right? We're called to be fully virtuous, to abide in light with no darkness, to have life with no death, good with no evil, right? So we're not talking about effort or desire or action or fulfillment, right? All of that is to be 100%. When we talk about moderation, it's simply not making an error of deficiency or excess, right? And this we see in Aristotle, but we also see this in the church fathers. Not that they are necessarily just taking something from Aristotle at face value, whatever it is, that's like, we're going to follow it because Aristotle's our teacher. No, because Aristotle arrived through philosophy at what the Jews and the Christians were arriving at through divine revelation. God, of course, is the enlightener of all men, both those who were the philosophers and also those who, were in the chosen community, the people of God, whether it be Old or New Testament. So the revelation is coming from the same source, and the teaching is, very, very similar here. So next, I think we're on, is it Andrew?
Yeah. Aristotle's ethical theory centers on the idea that moral virtue is achieved through moderation and balance. Each virtue is a mean between two extremes, which are vices of excess and deficiency. By practicing moderation and striving for balance, individuals can cultivate moral virtues and live a good, fulfilling life. This balance is not an absolute mean, but rather a relative one, depending on the circumstances and individual differences, and should be determined by practical wisdom.
Thank you. So let's take a look at some of these examples on the virtue continuum. All right, so let's look at something that's pretty easy. So diligence, right? Diligence is a virtue. If we don't have any diligence, we'll simply be lazy or slothful, right? We'll accomplish nothing, lacking diligence. However, diligence, if it's on steroids, if it's out of control, it can lead us to be workaholics, right? And, in our daily lives, we probably could imagine people on both sides of the spectrum, right? Or perhaps we ourselves have been on both sides of the spectrum. One day we might be pretty lazy, and the next day, we might be working so hard that we forgot to eat, or we're not interested in talking to somebody who's, in need or something like that. We're working on what we're working on. And that kind of spectrum is can be lived out in our own lives as we vacillate between two different types of vice, and as we try to, as best we can, walk that middle path of diligence. So another one, humility, right? If we are lacking in humility, we become prideful, vainglorious, right? We show off, we brag, all of that stuff. How about degradation, though? If we have too much, let's say, humility, where we devalue ourselves, degradation is an equal sin against God. Pride, because we elevate ourselves above God, right? Degradation, because we devalue the image of God that has been gifted to us, right? No matter what we've done, who we've become, we have been created in God's image, and we are of, an infinite value. So humility for the Christian walks this middle road between pride and degradation. Okay, so how about here's one for today: love. All right, so love could lead to selfishness, right? Where if we have no love for God and for our neighbor, then the only love we've got is for ourselves, right? And the two great commandments are to love God and love one's neighbor, right? Is the third commandment to love ourselves? It's not, right? We're called, not to love ourselves. We're called to love God and love our neighbor as we already do love ourselves. We already do that pretty well, right? So we need to extend that love to others. Love is something that is meant to go out to the other. So it is not meant to be inward. It's meant to be outward. Love unites. Okay, but if there's too much love, and when we say too much love, we're talking about an excess that destroys the very content and character of love, right? It twists it and makes it something that it isn't, and that would be enablement, right? Allowing others to do whatever it is that they want to do out of some kind of false version of love, right? And that we see in today's society very much. It's kind of rampant. If you don't agree with what everybody else is doing, the accusation will be made against you that you don't love them, right? You have to not only love them personally, but you have to love what they're doing. And, don't dare stand in the way of what anybody is doing. Because if you did, it's a sin against love, right? And love, it is the preeminent virtue, right? It is. So this accusation, that if you don't let me do whatever it is that I want to do, you don't love me. It's a very serious thing. We are very quick to be upset by that. And that's why it's so powerful. This kind of false understanding of love being that of enablement. All parents come to realize that, if they love their children, they cannot give them whatever they want, right? Love is sometimes tough, but love is always for the good of the other. It's not necessarily what they want, but it's what they need, right? So this excess love leads to enablement, and again, it's really rampant in our day and age. So do you want to look at any other ones? I mean, like courage is another one. If you're lacking courage, you become cowardly. If you have too much courage, kind of, you're foolhardy. It's like a false bravado. You become reckless, right? So virtue has to be full, right? But it has to be in between the two vices, one on the left, which is deficiency, and one on the right, which is excess. So that's a contribution that we have from Aristotle. Okay, let's move on. So we'll get into the Stoics, and I think we'll probably close out today with the Stoics. So Georgianne, do you mind taking this one for us, please?
The Stoics. Stoicism is an ancient Greek philosophy, 300 BC to 300 AD, teaching that virtue, the highest good, is based on knowledge. The wise live in harmony with the divine reason, logos, that governs nature, maintain equanimity in adversity, and control destructive emotions through rationality and self-discipline. Although Stoicism as an organized school declined after the 3rd century AD, its influence persisted through later philosophical and religious thought, including early Christian writers.
Thank you, Georgianne. So one of the reasons, by the way, that Stoicism declined after the 3rd century is because of the rise of Christianity.
Mm.
When you have something that is preparatory, or something that is pointing to that which is to come, when the fulfillment comes, the preparatory thing begins to fade. That which is incomplete being replaced by that which is complete. And that's what we see with Stoicism and Greek philosophy in general. It found its fulfillment in Christianity. The Stoics, though, they were kind of a really important group of philosophers in preparing the way, because they kind of incorporated much of the teaching that preceded them, and they became very popular. Even today, there are a number of people that read Stoics, like Marcus Aurelius, who was one of the Roman emperors, and others whose texts still influence modern man. But the church fathers, they took from Stoicism that which was good, and they left that which wasn't. Some of the things that they took are outlined here. We kind of see some of the Stoic principles as precursors then to Christianity. So next, I think we're back to Suzanne.
Yes. Stoicism, a precursor to Christianity. Ethical emphasis. Stoicism's focus on virtue and moral integrity, aligned with Christian teachings on ethical living. Universal brotherhood. Stoic ideals of a universal human community resonated with Christian doctrine of a united church and the equality of all. Divine providence. Stoic belief in a rational guiding principle, logos, governing the universe paralleled Christian beliefs in a divine plan. Inner peace and resilience. Stoic teachings on tranquility and resilience in suffering complemented Christian messages of finding peace through faith. Focus on inner life. Emphasis on inner virtue over external success, aligned with Christian focus on spiritual life and internal transformation. Detachment from materialism. Stoic practices of detachment from material wealth mirrored Christian teachings on the dangers of materialism. Ethical monotheism. Stoicism's monotheistic tendencies and belief in a rational order supported the Christian belief in one God. Moral exemplars. Stoic philosophers, like Christian saints, served as role models of virtue and wisdom. Respect for reason. Stoic respect for a rational understanding of the world made intellectuals more receptive to Christian theological arguments. Personal transformation. The Stoic goal of personal improvement and self-mastery prepared people for the concept of spiritual conversion and growth.
Thank you, Suzanne. So you can see in the image on the left, you have kind of this statue of a Stoic philosopher, and on the right, you have a depiction of Jesus Christ, right? So the understanding here is that the Stoics were unwittingly preparing the way for Christ, and many of the principles that they kept were corresponded to the same principles that you might see in the lives of the Jewish prophets, right? So the idea of ethics, a brotherhood among men, of course, divine providence, inner peace in the face of a world of chaos, focus on, the spiritual life, detachment from that which is material, this understanding of there being a law of ethics from a source beyond men, and the idea that that law must be followed by men, and those men become examples of how we should live as individuals and in community. A respect for reason would be paralleled with a respect for divine revelation, right? The logos speaking through both. And then, of course, personal transformation. The idea that man must become more than he is currently, that he must move towards that which is good, that which is highest, that which is transcendent. Are there any differences that we might say between Greek philosophers or Stoicism and Stoic philosophers in particular? Absolutely. So can you give me one major difference between Greek philosophers and Christians? Well, the most, I think, glaring difference is the belief in the resurrection, right? For the Stoics, for the Greeks who followed Platonic thought, there was kind of an understanding that the spiritual was good, the physical was bad, right? And man was to be freed from that which is physical. He was to be freed from his own body, which is kind of like a prison cell, a chamber which man's soul is held captive, from which he must escape never to return, right? So the idea of resurrection is something that would be abhorrent to Greek philosophers or to the Stoics. They did not have a desire for resurrection. Another correspondent idea or principle that would be rejected would be the cross. The cross, was what, a stumbling block to the Jews and foolishness to the Greeks. The idea that you would lay down your life, and this is not just like to practice discipline or self-control, self-denial, but to be able even to go and to face death. That was something that was fearful because death had not been conquered. The reason why Christians are not or should not be fearful of the cross or death is because Christ has overcome our mortality, our corruption. He's overcome death. So Christians have a goal to embrace their cross. By dying, they live, right? Where for the Stoics, it wasn't really about that. It was about trying to live the best life that you possibly could, following ethical and moral guidelines and principles, right? That we just looked at some of them here, but they didn't have a concept of the cross. So the cross and the resurrection are things that eluded them. They escaped them. Certainly, and you'll hear modern commentators like Jordan Peterson talking about how, in psychology or, in kind of the behavioral science disciplines, you have this idea that you have to continually be reborn, you have to change yourself, that the old man in you kind of has to die, and then, a new aspect to your personhood has to come about, and this is kind of death and resurrection, and this is how improvement works, right? So there's this kind of concept of improvement that always existed, this personal transformation, but not to the point where we're talking about actually being willing to die, right? Being willing to lose your life in its entirety. So you have kind of maybe baby steps towards that in the philosophers, but in Christ you have fullness, right? So some similarities and some differences between Stoicism and Christianity. Next time we'll get into a little bit of Chinese philosophy, and won't do too much there because for most of us, we don't have really a background in Chinese philosophy. I myself fall into that camp, so I'm not going to try to pretend to be an expert like I pretend to be an expert on other subjects. We'll simply, do kind of an overview on Chinese philosophy, but I think it'll still be interesting nonetheless.